morning, everyone. Have some updates for you on the CARES Act stimulus funding, some new information that you might not have seen if you've been on vacation in the last week or so. So as I'm going to share my screen here and run through a few slides with you just to hit some high points of some of the funding initially, and then get into some of the more detailed information. So want to start out with a general disclaimer that I'm required to put. Although there are attorneys in this presentation, I am not an attorney and I do not represent anyone, and this is guidance from TEA that is subject to change as the wind blows. It seems like this last couple of weeks as we get new information from USDE. This does not constitute legal advice, and you should seek legal advice from your attorney. So as we talk about CARES Act, there are multiple different stimulus bills. The CARES Act is the third stimulus bill that was passed that actually contains many different sources of fundings that are going to impact LEAs. Different fund sources will impact different LEAs. Some fund sources will impact everyone. So you have to differentiate. Most people call the funding CARES Act, and that's actually the statute. The fund sources are within CARES Act, and there are multiples. So we're going to start with a high-level overview. One of the sources of funds is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. This is called GEAR. It is a block grant to the Governor's office. And the allowable uses of this funding is for K-12 education and higher education. We don't know final decisions on the GEAR money yet, but we do know that a portion of that money will be coming to TEA, and we will be implementing statewide projects primarily that will serve all LEAs with this funding. But the actual amount and what projects are going to come is still yet to be determined. Now, Section 18003 is the Elementary Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, which is ESSER. This is the money that most people are normally talking about when they talk about CARES money. It's actually one of the fund sources, and 90% of the ESSER funds go directly to LEAs by statute, by a formula, as a grant program. And then the remaining 10% is state-level discretionary funding, of which the agency is putting out statewide projects to benefit all LEAs. The most recent one you may have heard about was the commissioner announced yesterday that we have put out a Texas Home Learning platform available to every LEA in the state free for 2 years. So if you don't have a management system for online learning, the agency has now provided that to everyone free, no charge for the 2-year period. Other fund sources in the CARES Act, some of these are going to impact different numbers of LEAs, but in Title 8 of the CARES Act, there is a Child Care Development Block Grant funding. This is funding that will be reimbursed by, I believe, Texas Workforce Commission. It will impact only those LEAs who open campuses up as child care centers for the children of essential workers. Now, if your LEA did this and you provided a facility child care for frontline workers, most of the time people think about only first responders as being the essential workers that the funding covers. But if you're in this situation, you need to look much more detailed at the statute, because children of essential workers is defined in the statute, and it is much broader categories than just first responders. So you may be eligible to apply for some of this additional funding if your district did open and provide childcare for essential workers. Another source of funds that is starting to become very important is Section 5001. This is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This is funding that is from the Department of Treasury that is administered to the governor's office, and the governor's office and then certain high population counties and cities receive this CRF funding for government uses. So it's got a lot of flexibility. So the governor and legislative leadership have appropriated amounts of the state CRF funding for a couple of different things. The first one is reimbursing schools for COVID-19 expenses as of May 20th. This is the CRF LAA reimbursement program that we talked about back in June, that was originally going to be run by TEA, then was moved to be run by Department of Emergency Management. And you haven't heard anything on this, but you're fixing to. It's coming out. It's going to release this week. This money also is using purchasing for e-learning devices under Project Connectivity, that you'll hear more about, and then a reimbursement program that's going to follow up a little bit later for LEAs that have already purchased their technology purchases that don't take advantage of the bulk purchase under Operation Connectivity. So Coronavirus Relief Fund is starting to be another very important fund source for districts to pay attention to. There's another grant called School Emergency Response to Violence. Now, the name is a little off, but the School Emergency Response to Violence statute is old statute from about 10 or 12 years ago, that it was the first federal response for school safety. And so it has the name Emergency Response to Violence, but it has been transitioned over the past 10 years to not only put funding out in emergency situations for school safety, but also in disasters. So the CARES Act also put funding in SERV for the pandemic. It's $100 million state across the country. Just by sheer numbers and history and kind of knowing how much Texas normally gets out of various pots of money, we expect there may be 8 to 9 million that comes to the state. Unfortunately, USD is not going to implement this program until later in the fall. And when I was talking with the program office at USDE last week, they're really focused on waiting with this money to see what needs are still existing after people use the ESSER funding, the GEAR funding, the CRF funding. And so we don't know when exactly this is coming out, but they expect they'll release the information late fall. But this is also another grant that will be coming to the state at some point under CARES Act. There's also FEMA reimbursement for Category B expenses. For school districts and charters, this is only cost of cleaning and sanitizing facilities following CDC standards during the time of the disaster declaration. The one thing you have to be aware here is it's very limited reimbursement, but if you have costs that are eligible for this FEMA reimbursement, you have to apply for that funding. The one thing to be aware of, if you are putting off cleaning and sanitizing buildings until right before you reopen the building for students and teachers to come in, you have to be aware of this last phrase, that it's only available if the cost was incurred during the disaster declaration. So at whatever point the disaster declaration ends, any costs after that date would not be eligible for reimbursement. So you just need to pay attention to that. School lunch program also received additional money under CARES Act, and your district's charters just applied through the normal formula program to Department of Ag to get your additional school lunch money that you may be eligible for providing those additional meals that you provided during times of closure. So we're going to talk mainly right now about the ESSER Act. This is the big pot of money to districts and charters. The total that came to the state is $1.285 billion. By statute, 90% of that goes out as subgrants to LEAs. By formula, that's $1.157 billion that went out by formula. The formula is a proportionate share of Title I Part A funding of the state level for the previous school year. So if a district charter did not qualify or did not accept Title I Part A funding, then they do not get an ESSER grant allocation. Some important dates. USD is allowing pre-award on this grant back to March 13th. March 13th is the date of the National Disaster Declaration. This is unusual because USD normally does not approve pre-award in advance. But because of the pandemic, they are allowing the grant funding to begin with a pre-award date of March 13th. The CARES Act was actually signed on March 27th. TEA received our federal award on March 15th, which triggers a one-year date of March 15, 2021, that all the money must be issued to NOGAs within 1 year, or it goes back to USDE to be reallocated to other states. We will easily meet this May 15, 2021 deadline. The funds actually end September 30th of 2021, but you do have a 12-month carryover under the Tidings Amendment. So your funding project date is actually March 13th of 2020 through September 30th of 22. So that's how you get the full range, even though you will see some documents that say the funding ends September 30th of 2021, you do have the 12-month carryover period, so it is available through September 30th of 2022. The allowable uses on this money, there is some confusion. There are some people across the state who are giving out misinformation, and I'm really worried about it because they're going to cause problems for LEAs, and whenever they get audited and monitored, it's going to cause a problem and they're going to have to pay the money back because there is wrong information out there. So I really want to stress that you need to be listening to TEA, to my department. We administer the funds, to the ESCs that we are working with because they've got the latest information. The biggest misconception is that you can use this ESSER grant money for anything you would have used state funding for. That's not true. This money is very flexible, but it is not anything and everything. This is a federal grant, and you have to follow federal rules, federal allowable costs, and federal regulations. It's a federal grant just like any other grant. And USDE is being very clear that all activities that are paid with ESSER funds must be reasonable and necessary, but they must also meet the overall purpose of ESSER, which is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the pandemic. So with that intent of the money in mind, you have allowable uses which are very broad. Any allowable costs under ESSA, IDEA, Perkins, McKinney-Vento, adult and family literacy. That right there gives you a very broad flexibility, but it's not everything. It then goes in statute, it goes on to list items 2 through 12 in the allowable activities, which are all very specific to pandemic type costs. If you have a cost you want to expend ESSER funds for, but you're having a hard time making it match one of the 12 allowable activities, go to item number 12. It is the broadest and it is the most flexible. But you still have to tie every expense to one of those 12 allowable activities, and it has to meet the overall purpose of the program to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the pandemic. There are some things that are unallowable, specifically subsidizing and offsetting executive salaries for anyone that's not an employee of the state or the LEA, expenditures related to state and local teacher or faculty unions or associations, bonuses, merit pay, similar type things related to disruptions, unless it's related to the disruption or closure from the pandemic. On item 3, there's a lot of concern for some people about extra duty pay that they might have paid to staff working during the pandemic. As long as you can document it and closely tie it to the disruption or closure caused by the pandemic, that extra duty pay is okay. Real quick again, there is no supplemental requirement on the ESSER funds. This also gives you flexibility. But just because there's no supplement, not supplant requirement, it still has to meet the requirements of reasonable, necessary, allowable, and allocable to the grant. So a lot of people want to see it's no supplements, not supplant requirement means I can pay anything. And again, that's incorrect. It's on the supplement, not supplant is only one regulation that does not exist. The other requirements still do exist. But because it is not have a supplemental requirement, you can use your unrestricted indirect cost rate on this grant. And you hardly ever get a federal grant where you can use the unrestricted rate. The unrestricted rate is your higher indirect cost rate. This will be different, and it will be preloaded in the system to allow your unrestricted rate. A lot of people are asking questions. Do you have to use the unrestricted rate? Can you still use the restricted rate, or can you use a different percentage? Yes, you can. It just allows you to use up to the unrestricted indirect cost rate. You can use less. You can use your restricted rate. Some people have a set indirect. They always charge X amount for indirect, even though their restricted rate is higher than that. You can still do that. It just gives you the flexibility to use up to your unrestricted rate. So I'm going to spend a minute and talk about the piece that confuses people because ESSER is being used to offset a reduction in state funding. So if we looked at the expectation with sales taxes, all the economic impact of the pandemic that has happened within the state, everybody knew there was going to be a reduction in state funding being available. People anticipated that 1920 would be able to remain pretty much whole, and then there would be a reduction in 2021 because of the economic shortfall. So without ESSER, there would have been a shortfall regardless. So the ESSER grant comes along, it allows supplanting. So districts and charters, you had been promised a hold harmless on the 1920 school year. While people anticipated that was going to all be met with state funding, in reality, an amount of your ESSER grant is being used to help fill that hold harmless promise. And then that allows us to try to keep 2021 funding at the state level whole. So I know it's not what people expected. You thought you were going to get the ESSER grant and it would be supplemental on top of everything else, but it's not. And it's not intended to be supplemental, or they would have put a supplement not supplant clause in it. Many states are doing the exact same thing. It's what Texas is doing. So we're using ESSER to offset the reduction in state funding. This is causing some of the confusion that people think they can then treat this federal grant as if it is state money, and you cannot do that. It is still a federal grant. So in reality, what your funding picture looks like, you are basically kept whole for 1920 using the ESSER money to be part of that hold harmless. Your state funding should be pretty much kept whole for 2021. You are going to get additional money through the CRF reimbursement program to the LEAs that the Department of Emergency Management is operating, and along comes Operation Connectivity, which will either provide a lot of funding in a bulk purchase of equipment or a reimbursement program. So the actual picture is there is more money in total being made available to the LEA. This is from USDE. When people don't like what we're doing and they try to complain to the Department of Ed, they're just going to be sent back down to us, and then the Department of Ed says, here, this is what we told them, or whatever. This came in from USDE yesterday, that, just to reiterate that the ESSER funding retains its identification as a federal grant and does not become state or local funds, even if you're using it for something that your state or local funds would have been used for. And so I think this is in regard to the ESSER grant being used to offset the reduction in state funding. And it ties back to what I said earlier, it's still a federal grant. You have to follow the federal grant rules, you have to document it, report it, and treat it as a federal grant. So we're doing some things different with this ESSER funding to try to help you. One of the things that we are issuing a preliminary no-go by email within 10 days of receipt of your complete application for the ESSER grant. And that preliminary no-go releases 20% of your funding, makes 20% of your funding available to you, even though we have not reviewed, approved, or negotiated your application yet. So this is a pilot project. You'll get an email preliminary no-go within 10 days, and you get access to 20% of your funding. Your final no-go will release the remaining money once your application is negotiated and approved. The allocations remains a big question from LEAs. In statute, the formula for distributing the ESSER money is to use the same proportionate share that the LEA receives of the state's Title I grant in 2019-2020. So what that all translates down to is, we get X amount for Title I to the state. If your district received 1% of that Title I total allocation by the formulas, then your district receives 1% of the ESSER grant. So it's a proportionate share. It is just a distribution formula that uses Title I. It in no way ties this money to Title I, and this is not Title I money. It is a separate federal grant. Now, what you received were planning amounts because USDE said we have to reserve funding to potentially award ESSER grants to new charter schools who open in the 2021 school year who are also Title I eligible. So there was a very small amount of this ESSER funding that was reserved and will be distributed in the fall if the three, it was four, one has postponed, there's now 3 new charter schools opening in the fall. If when they submit their data, they are Title I eligible, they will get a Title I calculation calculated to get an allocation, and then that proportionate share would calculate into ESSER. So in the late fall, there will be some minor adjustment. We expect that mostly you will just see a small bump, in small increase in the ESSER allocation as we put this reserve back into the formula after we take out what 3 charter schools may be eligible for. Big news is that the ESSER quarterly reports are no longer required. USD has moved the CARES Act funding from one program office to a different program office, and the new program office is using existing reporting mechanisms to meet the reporting requirement that is in the CARES Act statute. There are existing reports that TEA already submits on a monthly basis, and so that will meet the statutorily required quarterly reporting. We will no longer have to collect data from the districts on a quarterly report. There will be an annual report at the end of year 1 and a final report at the end of year 2. We do not know what they're going to look like, but we will share that information with LEAs as soon as we find out what those data elements are and what kind of time frame USDE requires. Monitoring is still going to be important. It's federal stimulus money. You can be guaranteed these ESSER grants in any of these fund sources, not just ESSER, but any of the fund sources under the CARES Act will be monitored at all levels. At the federal level, the Office of Inspector General for each federal agency has funding and will be auditing. This very much could be a major program in your federal audit with your independent auditor. The way to think about it is if your independent auditor looks at Title I, then your ESSER grant will likely be large enough to be a major program and be part of your federal audit as well. At the state level, we are required to monitor both fiscal and programmatic, and we will be doing fiscal monitoring over the next 2 years of this money, and we will be doing targeted programmatic validations. The thing will be a little bit different on the program compliance monitoring through the validations. Some of the other programs, when you get selected for a validation, you may have 5 or 6 requirements they're validating. We're going to do targeted validations. We're going to do 1 requirement at a time. So if you get selected, you're most likely going to be looking at 1 requirement, not multiple requirements. At the local level, you are still required under EDGAR, and because this is a federal grant, to have internal control procedures, policies and procedures, and that you are monitoring your own implementation of those policies, procedures, and internal controls. So monitoring at every level. Some of the changes that have recently come out, construction is now allowed under the ESSER grant for LEAs. It is not allowed for private school equitable services. And the justification is the #1 activity allowable in statute says any activity authorized by ESSER or another list of programs. Under Title VII of ESSER, the Impact Aid Program construction can be allowable. So USD has said construction can be allowable under ESSER, subject to prior written approval by TEA. If you want to use ESSER funds for any type of construction or remodeling project that is allowable and aligns to the intent and purpose of the ESSER grant, you need to request prior approval from our office, and we do not have a specific form for that because construction is normally never allowed. So you will just send an email justification to our grant support email address that you'll see at the end of the slides to get that pre-approval. There is a definition of construction of what's allowable, so it's somewhat broad. Because it's allowable under Title VII, the construction or renovation must meet the Title VII definition, and anything that is over $2,000 must meet all the Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirement and have the language included in the contracts. So this is going to be very specific if the LAA does want to use the funding for construction. Some good flexibility that just came out of TEA is around time and effort documentation. USD is saying that an LEA must only maintain time and effort distribution records when an individual employee being paid with ESSER money is splitting their time between activities that may be funded and may not be funded under ESSER. However, they went on to say there are very limited circumstances when time and effort would be needed under ESSER, because even if you're only paying part of the person's salary, almost any LEA staff position in your LEA is going to be an allowable activity under ESSER. So almost any position. There will be a few that are not allowable. But in general, you won't need time and effort because most of your FTEs could be allowable activities under ESSER. We talked about operating costs, including utilities. They can be allowable under item 12 in the allowable uses. So what they said is, since and we're really talking about pre-award costs, costs back to March 13th that you're wanting to reimburse with your ESSER grant. Since you didn't have an ESSER award at that time, you did not have to have followed federal procurement rules for procurements during that time period of March 13th up until the point you receive an ESSER award. So you just have to document that you did follow state and local procurement rules at the time and that it's a reasonable, necessary, and allowable cost. You don't have to document or meet federal procurement rules. The other part of that is you have to be treating any type of operating costs consistently. They either have to be all direct cost or all indirect cost. You can't be inconsistent. They must be reasonable, necessary, meet that overall purpose of the pandemic. But specifically, March 13th to date, you get that preliminary NOGA. You don't have to be able to document federal procurement process was met. Now, once you got the federal award, once you get that preliminary NOGA, you now have to follow federal procurement rules. So to be able to pay utility costs, operating costs, some of these other things, you're really looking primarily just at the pre-award cost. So that time period, March 13th till you receive the NOGA. However, we really are still questioning USDE on this because, like, utility costs. Your procurement for that utility contract was probably last summer preparing for your fiscal year. You did not have an award. You did not know there would even be a pandemic or be stimulus funding. So we're really kind of still pushing and having an ongoing conversation with USD, trying to get them to broaden this past the date you get the preliminary NOGA. If we're successful in that, we'll update the FAQ and let you know that. But right now, you do not need to document federal procurement for any costs from March 13th up to the date you receive a preliminary NOGA. You can consolidate your ESSER admin funds into your ESSA Consolidated Administrative Fund and take advantage of that flexibility. There were some changes to the private school rules. There is a complete private school training on TEA's YouTube channel, and then our department has a playlist where all of our recorded training is being posted. You can watch a complete training there. Some of the recent changes, you know, the construction, renovation, repair is not allowed, but you can pay for minor adjustments that are easily removable. And any equipment supplies that's placed must be able to be removed from the private school without any remodeling. There are some minor improvements you can do, and there are some examples of temporary tents for screening, temporary partitions for social distancing. Those things that can be easily removed may be allowable as equitable service. There are also certain instances where you can now reimburse the private school for allowable costs that they incurred between March 13th and the date you began consultation. So that is additional flexibility. Normally you would never send funding to the private school as equitable services, but USD is now ruling that there are some instances when that can be allowable. That's in our FAQ update on the website. You just have to keep some rules around that, and that can even include if the private school purchased laptops or electronic remote learning devices, that the district can actually purchase those from the private school at the cost they paid for it, and the district becomes the owner, keeps the title and everything, and reimburses the private school, and that becomes their equitable services. But there's some rules around all this, and the private school still must be able to provide all the documentation that's necessary for the purchase. Real quickly on the CRF-LEA reimbursement program, the Commissioner announced it yesterday in the superintendent call. TDM plans to open the guidance and the application process on Thursday, tomorrow. The application will be open through September 30th, and they will start offering training daily. I believe the first training is at 1 o'clock tomorrow, so when it opens in the morning, you can go in and get the training information and join the training tomorrow afternoon if you wish. That training will be available daily for 2 or 3 weeks, and then it'll drop down and continue to be offered 2 to 3 times per week. The Operation Connectivity, there was some guidance released yesterday, an FAQ released yesterday on the bulk purchase program. There will be more guidance on the reimbursement program coming out soon once the program is developed out. And this is the email address that I mentioned earlier. If you have questions about your ESSER grants, send them to grantsupport@tea.texas.gov, and they will come to our department, and we're glad to help you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to John.